I love heavy electronic music, stuff that really kicks you in the face with punchy drums and pounding, gritty basses. I also love the portability and workflow and sound engine of the Novation Circuit, and it can really lend itself to some really heavy stuff if used properly. A lot of the synth and groovebox community here on YouTube tends to put more focus on old school electronic music and kind of more chill music, which no problem with that at all. I make a good bit of that kind of stuff myself and I really enjoy it. But I think there's a bit of untapped potential in synths and grooveboxes and hardware for making heavy electronic music. So that's what I'm going to be exploring today and showing you how to pull off yourself. And really, a lot of these techniques will apply in any production environment, whether you're using hardware or only software. So without any further ado, let's jump into the circuit. To start things off, I'm going to play the beat that is being used for demonstration purposes in this video. So there's a lot going on here and I'll break that down. First of all, let's talk a bit about the sounds themselves, the design and the selection. In this case, I didn't design anything completely from scratch. I modified a good amount of stuff to get these sounds out of it. But in order to get heavy sounds, you either should be designing them yourself with heaviness in mind, or if you're getting a Novation Circuit pack or two, I can mention a few specific ones that really lend themselves to that heavier sound. First of all, the source of both of these basses is dubstep, sold on Isotonic's site. This pack I've really been loving lately for heavy bass stuff, and I can play each of these bass layers isolated, and I'll get back to the layering in a bit. And then the main one. My one complaint with the pack is the drums. They don't really do it for me, so in this case I've switched this out with my own free Novation Circuit drum pack, link in the description, and also you can download those as WAV files and use them in whatever, completely royalty free and all that. So, these are the drums by themselves. And while I'm thinking about it, another really good pack for heavy stuff is Tom Cosm's pack, also sold on Isotonic. So let's start this off by jumping into the sounds themselves and what makes them heavy. So to start things off with the kick and the snare. What's going on here is a couple of things. First of all, they've got an incredible amount of attack to them, and that allows them to really cut through the mix, which for me has been a big deal for getting my drums to really punch through. Plus, they were compressed a ton beforehand, and in this case, they're not super low-end heavy, and they're a bit distorted. Once again, adding some grit and allowing them to properly punch through without kind of weighing down the mix with unnecessary low-end. There's a slightly different version of this that I'll probably be turning into a full jam at some point. These have a very similar approach to them, but you'll notice they aren't as heavy because, for one thing, they're not compressed as much and the transients aren't as emphasized. So I still like this, and I like the vibe of this for kind of a dark synth style song, but I think these kind of dubstep style drums are a little heavier because they're so short and because they have such sharp attacks. Moving on to the synths. This synth is incredibly wide, for one thing, which makes this sound big and immersive, and so I've got like the chorus effect cranked pretty good here. Probably a good bit of unison going on here as well. And then the major thing that's really giving it its heaviness is this distortion. Distortion is a huge part of what makes things heavy, both in electronic music and in other genres. And obviously, if you take it too far, it just becomes harsh and abrasive, but sometimes that can be a good thing. And sometimes there's a sweet spot where it's just harsh and abrasive enough, and it should be supplemented by something that's super low. So here's my sub. This is an octave lower than the other bass. And it's pretty gritty just by itself, but it doesn't really have the same impact. And this doesn't have the same impact by itself. You can hear the difference that that layering of the sub makes. And this is really pulling double duty. Part of it is that it's a sub, and part of it is that it's another gritty bass, but it's extremely focused down the middle. That allows this bass to be incredibly spread out and wide because we still have this foundational bass right here. And the two both serve their own unique purposes, and you don't really need a whole lot more than that other than these two layers to sound full because they both fill up the frequency spectrum and the stereo spectrum. Another part of making these basses sound heavy is their interaction with the drums. So I've got sidechain engaged decently heavily on both of these. And as a Novation Circuit tip, I've got both the kick and the snare on drum 1 because drum 1 is the only drum that engages the sidechain. So I'm using sample flip to just go back and forth between the kick and the snare. Because for heavy bass music, typically you do want to sidechain everything to the snare as well as the kick. The snare should make everything pump just as much as the kick does. Doing that goes a long way towards giving not only the snare more weight, but the basses more weight, ironically enough. While we're still vaguely on the subject of basses, let's talk a bit about the composition, because I actually think this goes really far in making a part heavy is its composition. When I was on my friend's masterclass account to prep for the deadmau5 video, I also took the opportunity to watch some of Tom Morello's masterclass, the guitarist from Rage Against the Machine, who is, in my opinion, one of the best riff writers of all time. And one thing that he was talking about with regards to writing riffs is this idea of always coming back to the root note. So every bar or every 2 bars, you come back to the root note of your key. And you keep reinforcing that. And you hear this actually a lot in bass music, especially stuff like dubstep, and that's emphasized even further by this horn. So let me just play this, bearing in mind that every bar it comes back to this root note, even at the turnaround at the very end. But that's like a huge switch up, which adds contrast. And I'll get back to contrast in a bit because that's also hugely important. But I love this method of writing something that is constantly going back to that root note. I think that's incredibly powerful, especially for bass music, and that's further emphasized by this horn that just plays every bar. And first of all, that's a super gritty sample, and I think that adds a lot to the heaviness. And also, it really emphasizes kind of the attitude of this beat. Creates this pounding repetition that I think goes a long way towards making this bass line feel heavy, even if I get rid of all the kind of extreme parts of the bass. And also notice the rhythm on this and the fact that it's kind of syncopated. It's kind of groovy. That was another thing that Tom Morello talked about in his masterclass, was the idea that making something groovy goes a long way towards making it heavy. And I tried to incorporate that sensibility into this bass line, although I would never compare myself to Tom Morello. He's a legend, and I'm just a kid making beats in his bedroom. And also, just for reference, this is the scale that I used, and I think scale choice can also go a long way towards helping something feel heavy. And the intervals you use can make something sound angrier or groovier, and as a result, heavier. So I mentioned contrast, and there are a few other ways that contrast pops up. First of all, in these little octave jumps that this bass does. I think that's an incredibly fun and easy method for making a bass line more interesting and often heavier, is doing octave jumps. You hear this a lot in hip hop with 808s doing jumps like that, and then you hear this a lot in some kinds of metal as well, with giant jumps along the neck in riffs, and that can also make something sound incredibly heavy. That contrast between low and high is pretty powerful. Another low and high, which is this little guy right here. This is just a sample with a bit of reverb on it, and I've pitched it to be vaguely at the root note. And I have this panned a bit to the right so that this hi-hat can be panned a bit to the left. Once again, maximizing my width here. But I think the contrast between the super high note and the super low bass also makes this feel a lot heavier. Another good example of when I did this is this drop right here from a previous song. The full thing is already on my channel. where you've got this incredibly punchy, low, chunky bass, and then this high synth part floating over the top of that. And that contrast between the really high and the really low and gritty also does a lot for making the grit of the bass and the lowness of the bass really stand out. And high end always adds energy, so the more you can interject high end into your bass lines, the better. This is Gabe from the future. Real quick, one more thing I want to mention that contributes to heaviness that I forgot to mention while making the video is limited layers. And this is something that the circuit kind of forces you to do, which is actually kind of nice. Making music with a more minimalist approach can often allow all the individual elements to really punch through and have a lot more power. Whereas if you layer a ton of stuff, elements end up masking each other and taking away from one another. So minimalistic layering can actually really make something sound huge. One more thing that I think leads to a lot of heaviness is constant switch ups and glitches. You kind of want to throw your listener for a loop a little bit. You don't want your beat to be so unhinged that it just confuses people, but adding some measure of controlled chaos into your beats is vital. And it's becoming incredibly popular in a lot of production lately, which I've been absolutely loving, and it's influenced a lot of the stuff I've been making lately. So here's one more example of a thing I was doing, and I'll show you what I mean. Once again, you've got coming back to the root note, and you got that kind of swaggery bass line. Little glitch sound effect there, automated in. So that shows a couple techniques that I want to talk about for introducing controlled chaos. First of all, this glitch sound effect here. This was built into the patch, where if you hold it down, it does all these lovely glitch sound effects. This one was designed by Gemfire. His pack is not as good for heavy stuff, but it's very good for like bass house, tech house, that kind of stuff, and some kind of glitchy IDM type stuff. I love this patch. It's so much fun. So what I did here was I used it in this. So midway through this beat, I started to introduce some of that glitchiness by automating that parameter to come in on that one little section. And then I do a session switch to this glitch part. And so I introduced that chaos. I let everything kind of break down into a mess. And then I unified again with a switch up. So your listener is kind of left wondering what just hit them, but in a good way. There's ear candy everywhere, and it constantly gives novelty to your listener. And I think that's a pretty important method for adding heaviness as well. And then in this section, first of all, we've got that call and response element going on where you have this intro note, once again hitting the root note, and then this bass. And then the call and response is a hugely important technique for bass music. There's a great video that Barely Alive did that I'll link down in the description about how to use call and response for bass music. Highly recommend giving that a watch. But also, you've got this pitch bend that's embedded in this patch. Once again, that's another element of controlled chaos, and pitch bends and pitch modulations like this are incredibly effective, especially for bass growls. And it adds quite a bit of heaviness. And of course, once again, this is a super distorted patch. And once again, you have your somewhat distorted, super punchy drums. I've wandered away a bit from the subject of contrast for adding heaviness, but I want to come back to this really quickly because the final way you can use contrast to your advantage is to very carefully control your buildups and your drops and create a heavy contrast between your builds and your drops. Not so much that your track feels disconnected, but you want to cut out a bunch of bass and cut a bunch of power so when the drop kicks in, it's all the more powerful. Hyping your listener up in some ways is even more important than the drop itself. So a good example is the track I was showing earlier. I've got a very kind of neutered version of that bass and a slightly high cut version of this ARP. So if I'm building this up, cut some lows. So I've teased that bass line, but with something that's not nearly as powerful, And I've got that ARP going to kind of build some energy, and if I want to take that even further, I could do drum builds and riser effects and all that kind of stuff, and I did a whole video dedicated to that I'll link both in the description and at the end of this video. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I earned your like on this video, and if you'd like to learn how to make build-ups and drops on the Novation Circuit, you can click or tap up over here. And if you're interested in more hardware and more heavy electronic music, be sure to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.